Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today's video is another installment in what could perhaps best be described as Jack rambles about what gods are and how they work. Actually, now that I say that, I might make a playlist, but sort of in the vein with other videos that I've done about the schmidentity of the gods, or I have another video about whether we create the gods. This is the kind of theological discussion that I really like to just sort of sit and try to tease apart, and so we're going to have another one of those on the channel today. Yesterday, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a Plato scholar. He's a classicist. And we ended up talking a little bit about Greek religion, and particularly the way that the conception of deities in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, was incredibly localized in a way that we, sort of in contemporary America, sometimes struggle to wrap our heads around. Right? So there was this idea that, like, we have our Hercules here, and this is our Hercules, and this is the one that we worship. And you might have your Hercules over there, and that's fine, that's all well and good, but, like, this one's ours. And, there's a sense, maybe, in which they're the same, they're both Hercules, but they're also different, because this one's right here, and yours is over there somewhere. You can think about this with, like, the multiple cult centers of Aphrodite. There was one at Paphos, there was one at Byblos, and, like, Aphrodite at Paphos was the Aphrodite of Paphos. And she was the localized goddess of that cult center, and was somehow distinct from the Aphrodite of Byblos. Even if, they're both Aphrodite in some sense, you might sort of recognize them, but, like, no. This one lives in Paphos, and that one lives in Byblos, and they're not the same. I think that the way that we're used to thinking about religion, particularly in America, where our notion of religion is so strongly colored by Protestant Christianity, we expect religion to be a single, coherent, unified thing with a fixed doctrine and a set pantheon that looks the same across all instances. And that's just really not what it was in the ancient world, or even really what it is in non-Christian religions that still exist today. So I think Hinduism is a really good example of this, right? Hinduism doesn't have the kind of top-down cohesion that we as Americans, in sort of an implicit Christian context, often expect of religion. A lot of the time, Hinduism, really, like, what we call Hinduism is a sort of loose collection of localized religious practices that have some kind of a unifying thread to them, but that aren't that don't fit into a rigid category of, like, this is the Hindu pantheon, these are the gods and how they relate to each other, and it's the same everywhere, right? In a lot of India, it'll sort of be the case that, like, the local goddess is that tree over there. And we'll call her Parvati. There's a sense in which she's sort of connected to the Parvati you might read about in the scriptures, or Parvati as you might find her in other temples elsewhere. But, like, no, this is very specifically, like, that tree is the sort of the body of the goddess, and we're talking about this one. We're not talking about some big abstract Parvati. We're talking about this Parvati here in this tree, who might have some kind of a broader connection. And that can be really hard for people who inhabit sort of this default, cultural context where we make certain assumptions about religion. It can be really hard to rewire ourselves to think about religion in that way. But I think it's a productive thing to do. This is, you get a little bit of the discussion of this in Neil Gaiman's novel American Gods, which I take theological issue with. I think it's a wonderful novel. I don't like it as a basis of pagan theology, which I think a lot of contemporary pagans really take it as, but at the end of that novel, one of the things that comes out is that, like, the Odin of Iceland is different from the Odin of America. And there's a sense maybe in which they're kind of the same, but there's also an important sense in which they're distinct from each other. So, I mean, you do sort of get this idea sometimes that, like, the gods, whatever they are multifaceted and fragmented even, and that, like, two gods in two different places can maybe have the same name, maybe have the same essence, but also be different from each other in some important way. This is that thing that I talked about in the Schmidentity video, right? Like, they're same, but different. There's a sense in which they're the same, and there's a sense in which they're distinct from each other. And I think that's particularly interesting when we turn our attention to something like Wicca. So, different lineages, different covens in Wicca are going to have different attitudes toward deity, and that's entirely to be expected. I come from a sort of branch of the Gardnerian family tree that sees Wicca very much as the priesthood of two particular deities. And that's really interesting when we think about those deities having emerged as localized deities of Great Britain. What happens when you take them and transplant them in a new geographic context, a new cultural context? Like, is the Wiccan goddess of Britain the same as the Wiccan goddess of America? You know, we might use the same name and all. We might even perform the same rites, but is there an important sense in which they're somehow different, right? Is this our goddess versus that goddess? Is this, the goddess who lives in this tree? And I don't have a clean answer to that. It's something I sort of rattle around in my brain. I think that I think that gods are complicated. And I think that there, is maybe a meaningful sense in which, like, the goddess of New Jersey is very different from the goddess of the New Forest, is very different from the goddess of Orlando, is very different from the goddess of, Denver. And there's something worth acknowledging about that. Even if we just think about the goddess as, like, the embodiment of the earth, right? The divine manifestation of the earth. The earth is so different in different parts of the world. The way that the changing seasons work, the way that the vegetation is and the local wildlife. And all of those things factor into who the goddess is there and how we relate to her. I remember the first summer solstice after I was initiated into Gardnerian Wicca. I was in Mexico at the time. And the experience of the summer solstice in Mexico, radically different from the experience of the summer solstice, religiously speaking, that I've had any other time that I've celebrated it as a Wiccan. Because I was in a different part of the world. The feeling of midsummer was different, right? It was hotter, it was more humid, it was this sort of lush, overwhelming green vegetation that just sort of overgrew everything. The wildlife was entirely different down there. I was in a part of Mexico where they had cenotes, those big sinkholes that filled with water. And just the feeling of connecting to the divine and the earth was very different in that part of the world. And so, I used the same name for the goddess as I was, praying to her and celebrating the solstice and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But she felt different. It was in some sense the same goddess and in some sense a different goddess. Now, as I say that, it feels maybe a little obvious that, like, the gods are sometimes the same and sometimes different, and, the gods are bigger than us. But it's like, I think if you just really sit with it and let it be strange, there's something really profound there. I often say that the gods are bigger than us, and that, no one perfectly understands the gods, and I stand by that. But when you really... I don't know what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that I think sometimes, particularly in my branch of Gardnerian Wicca, because we conceive of ourselves as a priesthood of two particular deities and we all use the same names, we think that we all have exactly the same goddess in this sort of like top-down cohesion way that I'm calling an implicitly Christian model, where like we sort of think that, okay, this is the pantheon that we have, and these are the myths, and these are the rituals, and it all sort of slots down, and then this is the thing that you have, and you transplant it to wherever you are, and it's the same more or less wherever you go. And in actuality, I think there is an element of something much more organic and something much more localized, even to a version of Wicca that conceives of itself as the priesthood of two particular deities, because those deities are different wherever you go. And, you know, like where I am, the goddess right here is different from the goddess anywhere else in the world. And part of what you're doing, even if you're using the same name and the same myths and the same rituals, like, even if all of that is the same, part of what you're doing is connecting to, like, no, this goddess right here, the one in that tree over there. So, I hope this video made sense. I'm going to leave it off here. Happy solstice to all who celebrate, and I will catch you in the new year.